mixed my business life with public service for over 20 years. It's been incredibly rewarding, but it's been enlightening because I think that the public sector does have its vices and its virtues, and I think that all of those issues come together in connection with the question of public debt more so than anything else, because public debt represents the place where, in trying to undertake those things that the public sector is obligated to do on behalf of the citizens that it serves, it makes a decision. It makes a choice as to how it's going to allocate certain resources and values. The very definition of politics, I will tell you, finds its way into the decisions we make on how we manage government and its finances. And this is certainly no new thing. It's not something that just started yesterday. We've been dealing with the issue of public debt for as long as we've been a country. Something called loan certificates were issued at the time of the Revolutionary War, mostly to the Netherlands and to France, to finance our country's independence. By 1783, our public debt was $43 million. I know certain people in the investment banking business who earn that in a year, but we won't sort of go down that road either. And that process was something you could tell that the sort of early America was struggling with. Alexander Hamilton, the sort of famed Secretary of the Treasury, was actually a great advocate of public debt. In fact, he described it in some of his writings as a true blessing, which, you know, I'm certain there are those who would disagree with. In fact, I can think of the person who would disagree with him most would be President Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury, who was sort of an advocate for exactly the opposite. And he got pretty far until the president he served undertook the Louisiana Purchase and then ultimately the War of 1812, and we were back very much in being a debtor nation in pretty short order. But ironically, by 1835, this country had essentially paid off all of its interest-bearing obligations, something that's sort of hard to imagine for a country that young at that period of time. Yet that didn't last very long, and the Civil War and all the things that we all know transpired in the period that ensued left us with a public debt in the period after the Civil War ended of somewhere just north of $2 billion. Again, by all the standards we're used to, not a great deal, but certainly you begin to understand how different moments in our country's history led to decisions which ultimately had their impact on how much debt. And again, I'm not commenting on whether it was good, bad, or indifferent, but simply the connection between what's happened to this country and its financial position certainly are inextricable. As time went on, certainly that process became more accentuated, and public debt has been an issue for every major thing that has happened. World War II was financed largely with the issuance of bonds that everyone understands, and the total cost of financing that was $211 billion. Again, you know, numbers that seem relatively small by current standards. But what's interesting in the post-World War II period is that, you know, government began to become far more active in many ways. And some of those things were laudable and some of them less so. But debt began to accumulate at absolutely staggering paces, regardless of what kind of metric you apply to it, such that by the time we got to the 1980s and people began to recognize that the baby boomers were going to eventually require an enormous amount of financial support to support the Medicare system, possibly the Medicaid system, as well as Social Security and other benefits, that we were at debt levels that were absolutely astronomical. And then in the 1990s, first President Bush and President Clinton actually were able to make some progress on the issue, ironically, with Congresses that were of the opposite party, and for a whole variety of reasons, and certainly a strengthening economy was part of it, we began to manage a process in a bit more of an aggressive manner, such that at least we were operating from a surplus point by the time that we got to 2000. And then essentially the pattern started to repeat itself again, only at this point the geometric acceleration of it achieved unbelievable heights, to the point of where we are today, where we have a country that has over $14 trillion in debt outstanding. I'm certain you've seen many of the statistics, but we are by 2013 going to be somewhere around 85% of GDP. It is an unsustainable paradigm by almost anyone's estimation. And the debate in Washington right now is not about whether we can sustain it or not. And, you know, I guess there are some exceptions. Paul Krugman and others have written about our over-reliance or over-concentration on the issue, not necessarily being well-placed. But by and large, most policymakers, who at least I've been exposed to, all agree that unless something's done about the debt situation, we will have enormous consequences. Because there are consequences to it. First of all, it's hard to imagine any paradigm under which we won't see interest rates climbing as a result of debt that we can't really control. Rising interest rates clearly will have a translation into mitigating our ability to sustain real growth in the economy, because as we start to crowd out certain investments, as a greater portion of our resources are used to service debt and less is available for building roads or providing tax incentives, that again, that'll have an incredibly direct impact on the economy. And all of that will likely lead to higher taxes. Because let's face it, as a nation, we've sort of wanted a lot, but not really wanted to pay for it. So there have been voices that seem to have found their way through the crowd that are asking for government to play certain roles, but similarly voices that are limiting the willingness to impose taxes in order to pay for those things have both been the voices that have seemed to have outstripped the balance of the crowd. So we end up with two groups that have won most of the arguments. Those who have looked for entitlements and those who have looked to control the amount of taxing authority that the government has over individuals. I could make great arguments for both groups, and I certainly can understand the positions taken in both settings, but realistically, it's left us in a situation where our options with each day are becoming more and more limited. So we start to talk about, well, what could be the potential solutions to it? And I think the introduction that Mr. Gentile mentioned is probably the perfect way of looking at it. There is no way to separate out from these decisions judgments that we make as people about what is important to us. The notion that we can somehow take, whether it is our faith tradition or what drives us to determine what we believe to be right and wrong, and extract that from the decisions that government makes or business makes, the idea that we can look at these things in sort of different silos, it is just impossible. And those who have tried it, I think, have probably failed in the attempt to do so. And I think what it ultimately boils down to, at least in my experience, and I have a distinguished co-panelist here who I'm sure can offer much greater insight into the science of economics and how we arrived at this position, but as a practitioner, someone who in both the private sector and public sector has interacted with government and interacted specifically in those areas where public debt and the whole issue of public debt has been part of the decisions that people have had to make. I would submit to you that part of the problem here is that there's just way too much noise in the discussion, that people are making decisions with very little substance and with lots of rhetoric. So we are making choices, not necessarily on their being right or wrong, but simply choices that people are making because it serves some short-term political objective or because it's too difficult to give people a more honest assessment as to what our choices really are. Most of the discussion that goes on in government finance about many of these issues goes on at levels where very little empirical data is considered, very little reasoned thought is put into the process. You would never consider the amount of resources that are being deployed as part of government spending in the same manner that government does pretty much on a daily basis. I will give you the perfect example that, and I was there for the process and I saw it. Whether you agree or disagree, we have a reasonably well-developed monetary policy, and we have institutions that over time have evolved to manage that. And they were born out of different crises that this country's had to endure, and certainly the Great Depression and the framework around that resulted in many of it. But say what you will, disagree with the Fed chair, disagree with those who are responsible for monetary policy, there is a reasonably intelligent system that exists to evaluate our choices and then ultimately make them. And again, we may not all agree, but that system exists and it has functioned with a certain amount of efficiency, I'd say, in the decades since those institutions were established. And they've become better over time, or at least have become clearer in terms of what they've had to do. But I would say to you that on the fiscal side, we have nothing like that. So think about the stimulus. We decided to spend nearly $1 trillion jumpstarting the economy. Regardless of whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, that process took place in the context of lots of people expressing lots of opinions, but with no real ability to sort of collate between what made sense and what didn't make sense. So I would say to you that our ability to grope with the issue of public debt, our ability to grope with, to handle the issue of financial responsibility in terms of the fiscal affairs of any government has to begin with a more honest assessment, a more intelligent and substantive assessment by those who are making those decisions. Thank you very much.